welcome everyone to Winnakee's International Day of the Forest. My name is Yuri Perrin, and I am the Senior Director of External Affairs at Winnakee Land Trust. We're thrilled to have so many new faces here. We have over 100 people signed up for today, which is just thrilling for us. I'd like to extend a big thanks to Todd of the Ruffed Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society for being an important part of this program today. I'd also like to acknowledge the New York Forest Owners Association for their incredible outreach and partnership for this event. Just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this video. It's already started, and I'll email you a copy of the video. We'll also put it on our YouTube channel. We're going to be muting everybody during the presentation, but we will take questions at the very end. So please put your questions in the chat function. And if people are interested in a particular question, please give it a thumbs up, and we'll go to the questions with the most interest first. Also, please know that our staff is available to you after the event, and don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have any questions. Okay, great. So let's get started. So in case you are not familiar with Winnakee's work, we are an accredited land trust that was founded in Rhinebeck, New York in 1989. That was a time when development threatened a lot of our rural landscapes. And under the leadership of our founder, Sally Mazzarella, Winnakee was instrumental in some key land protections that continue today to be credited for helping to safeguard the rural character of our region. Beautiful view sheds and trails, things that really enhance the quality of life and make this area a desired place to live. In response to new challenges in land protection, such as the changing climate, forest fragmentation, threats to biodiversity, Winnakee expanded our mission in 2019 to include protection of intact forest as a key conservation priority. In addition, we adopted active management plans for all the lands that we protect to help increase the sustainability of our landscapes. And we'll be talking more about this model and how it relates to landowners throughout the program. So here's an outline of today's talk and some of the key takeaways that we hope you will all walk away with. We will be discussing why young forests are disappearing in the first place. Todd will highlight what this means for a very special species, the American woodcock, whose ideal habitat happens to benefit a host of other wildlife. We will give examples of what healthy young forests look like and how to enhance them. And perhaps most importantly, we will offer insights into how young forest planning needs to be integrated into a broad landscape level approach to forest management. Finally, we will introduce you to our new landowner assistant program to help you get started. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Winnakee's Conservation Project Manager, Laura O'Brien. Laura grew up in northeastern Massachusetts. She says that she first fell in love with New York while getting her degree in environmental sciences from Ithaca College in the Finger Lakes. Laura has worked at various environmental organizations, including Trout Unlimited, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative, and most recently, the Piedmont Environmental Council, which is a land trust in Virginia. Here at Winnakee, Laura protects land in partnership with community members and other stakeholders through the acquisition of land and conservation easements. Today, Laura will be talking about why young forests are disappearing and how we are partnering with landowners to address this. We're thrilled to have her, and here's Laura.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Yuri. I hope everyone's really excited. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers today to help us learn about young forests and why they're so important and how we can manage for them. I'm going to kick us off with just a bit of context and history about why we're really digging into this topic today. So if you take a walk through, New York's forests today, you'll notice something is missing. Young, naturally regenerating woodlands. We have old trees, we have mature forests, we even have open fields, but young forests, those dense thickets of saplings and shrubs that are really difficult to make your way through, especially in the spring and the summer, they're becoming increasingly rare. So why is this happening? Well, we have to go back in time a little bit. New York's forests have been aging together. Most aren't true old growth, but rather even age forests that all started growing and maturing at about the same time. Throughout the mid to late 19th century, much of New York State was cleared for agriculture. However, when the Erie Canal and railroads opened and provided access to other fertile lands in the Midwest, many marginal farms in New York were ultimately abandoned. These lands naturally regrew into forests without that active management and clearing of their prior use as ag lands. And mostly this growth occurred all at once. By the early 1900s, vast stretches of what was once farmland had transitioned back to forest. Today, instead of a continuous cycle of forest renewal, what we see is a landscape dominated by mature woodlands, mostly about 80 to 90 years old, with very little young forest habitat. Unlike the past, farmland is no longer being abandoned at the same rate, meaning that fewer areas are naturally regenerating into this new forest, but we're still seeing the impact of the historic trend in our forests today. Historically, indigenous practices and natural disturbances like wildfires, windstorms, and beaver activity created a patchwork of young forest habitat. But today, fire suppression, human development, and a lack of active forest management has dramatically reduced these dynamic early successional forests. At the same time, heavy deer browsing, which I'm sure folks have experienced on their own properties quite a bit if you live around here, introduce pests and pathogens and invasive species, make it really difficult for young trees to take hold and outcompete these pressures. The loss of young forest has real consequences, as you're going to hear even more about later on today. These habitats, young forests, are critical for wildlife. You're going to hear about species like the American woodcock, ruffed grouse, and golden-winged warblers, which depend on young forests. Without young forests, these species decline and contribute to broader biodiversity losses that we're experiencing throughout the state and the region. And you can go ahead to the next slide. So kind of setting up that context, what can we do? Quite a bit of New York State's forests are privately owned, about 13.2 million acres. For landowners who want to support wildlife, active management is really the key here. In my role, I talk a lot about forest protection, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. We also really have to think about active stewardship and active management to not just protect our lands and our forests, but also restore them and support them. Creating young forest habitat through silviculture, deer management, and targeted invasive species control can restore these vital conditions. Even maintaining just a small component of young forests within a larger landscape can provide substantial benefits. In short, a healthy forest isn't just old trees. It's a balanced mix of young, middle-aged, mature stands, because all of these different types of forests provide different benefits to wildlife habitat and different ecosystem services. By taking an active role to ensure young forests remain part of New York's landscape, forest landowners like you can shape the future of New York's forests, ensuring that the next generation of trees and the wildlife that depend on them have a place to thrive. And luckily, you don't have to do it alone. Our region is really lucky to have a great network of experts and professionals who are already facilitating this work, conducting research on this work, and helping folks like you get involved. If you're interested in learning more about some of the management strategies or implementing some of the management strategies that our speakers are going to be talking about today, your first step is going to be reaching out to a conservation practitioner like someone at Winnakee Land Trust. Our staff can provide you with advice, or can also help connect you with one of our partners at another organization who are also engaged in this work. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Todd.
Todd grew up in the Adirondacks. He has worked in the conservation areas for almost 30 years. He's currently the Northeast Forest Conservation Director for the Rough Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. He has a BS in Resource Management from SUNY ESF and an MNR in Global Sustainability from Virginia Tech. Todd, thank you so much for being here.
Yuri, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you on a beautiful Friday, celebrating forests on International Day of the Forest. How's my audio? Everything clear coming through? Okay, great. Well, thanks for the wonderful introduction. As Yuri said, my name's Todd Waldron. I'm the Northeast Forest Conservation Director at American Woodcock Society and the Ruffed Grouse Society. I'm based in New York, up the river a little ways, near Lake George, and I work across New York and New England, uh, mostly on partnerships, fostering partnerships and building programs around healthy forests and how we can create an active hand toward fostering their conservation. So, Yuri, you want to hit the slide, please? Okay, great. So at Ruffed Grouse Society, backing up a little bit, we're a national conservation group, a bird group that's been around since 1961, formerly based in Rochester, New York at one point, founded down in Virginia, currently in Pittsburgh. We work across 6 regions in the US right now with our conservation partners. So we have about 30 conservation staff, and, we're a habitat organization working on healthy forests and conservation-minded forestry. And outside of the Northeast, we work in the Mid-Atlantic, all the way down to the Southern Appalachians, to the mountains of North Georgia and Western North Carolina, and up into the Great Lakes area, in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so we do this through partners, wonderful partners like Winnakee, and landowners like yourself and partners like yourself. So we're not a land trust. What we do is we're kind of a catalyst to work and to help connect people around funding and around technical assistance and around mobilizing action for forest diversity and wildlife and all the benefits that that provides. So our mission is around bringing people together. We're dot connectors, and really we work through ruffed grouse and American woodcock as bellwether species or barometers, but what they represent is a landscape of diverse functioning forest ecosystems. So, both of those birds are like check engine lights, like several other wildlife species, where if they're thriving, then we know forests are healthy, we know they're diverse, we know they're functioning well. So we can gauge how our forests are doing in part by looking at wildlife health and population trends. And so that's what we do. So healthy forests, abundant wildlife, and conservation, and spreading the word around conservation ethics is really what we're all about. Okay, next frame, please. And so, as Bob had mentioned, we have this big picture that's really a story about healthy and diverse forests and all the benefits that they can provide. And so, we kind of think of it in terms of like, if you look at all the wonderful outputs and outcomes and impacts that forests provide for us, the clean drinking water in the Catskills and wildlife habitat across New York and the Hudson Valley and respite and open space. All of these are outcomes of an ecologically minded forest conservation approach. And when it comes to forest conservation, there isn't a one size fits all. Sometimes the best way to protect a forest is by setting it aside, and that's wonderful. And sometimes it's an active hand approach where it's like, okay, the situation is such that the species, the land history, the disturbance regimes here, the wildlife that depend on it can take an active approach. And so if there's one thing I'd like you all to know is that all of those are great options to explore. Okay, so it's not an either or situation. It's an and conversation. And when we have healthy, diverse forests that are functioning, we have all these wonderful outputs. Okay, next slide. So one of the key species that we work through for this conservation approach is American woodcock. Anybody familiar with American woodcock here? It's one of my favorite birds, Scolopax minor. American woodcock is a snipe-related bird. There's 7 or 8 species around the world. There's Eurasian woodcock. American woodcock are our species here in the US. They're migratory birds. They're quirky, they're cool and fun. They go by names like Labrador Twister and Timberdoodle and Mudbat, and they're just coming back. So they migrate and they breed here in New York and in the Catskill region and Hudson Valley. I'm getting texts this week of friends saying that they're seeing them again. What they do is they migrate back and forth from here down into the southeast. They spend their winters in Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. They're about the size of a robin. Their bill is too long for them. Their ears are in front of their eyes. Their brain is upside down. They wobble around. They're just the coolest birds ever. Will they eat jumping worms? I hope so, because they love worms, and we're going to get to their diet. So if there's a bird out there that can take care of the jumping worm problem, I hope it's our friend, Mr. Timberdoodle and Miss Timberdoodle. Um, so, what they like is a mix of young forests and open habitat. They grow incredibly quickly. So the males and the females are about the same size. The hens are a little bit larger. A male is about the size of a robin. A hen is just a little bit bigger. They what they do is, they're really, um, what we see. Let me back up a little bit. I'll talk about the populations here on this slide. So all this cool stuff, I get excited about woodcock and I could talk about the birds, but let's talk about the facts here around their habitat. And so what we're seeing is general population decline that's systemic for the last several decades, right? So since the 1960s, we have these big mega trends. We have changing habitat conditions. We have declining habitat quality. We have declining occurrence of young forests on the landscape and open brushy lands as farmlands revert to natural woodlands and mature. We have development. We have a whole bunch of things happening here. But the big trend is, and not in just New York, but across the region, we have the situation where the species occurrence is declining. And that's alarming because they're the check engine light, remember? So when they're declining, that's telling us something about our forest conservation. Okay, so next. And so back to the birds. I just wanted to include some cool stuff here, some graphics about their biology. So this time of year, as you're seeing woodcock come back to the Hudson Valley, it's usually the males that come back first, and they're establishing what's called singing grounds, which is going to be where the breeding occurs. Breeding usually occurs in April and May. It's a courtship ritual, and the males will paint and they will do their sky dances. And you'll usually see this in the mornings and in the evenings. And as the breeding occurs, the females will choose like moist, thick woodlands areas. They're ground nesters, and they'll have a clutch of 4 eggs usually. So they're not prolific breeders in the sense that there's a lot of birds being born every year. Now, fortunately, the nest and young survival rate's pretty high. So of those 4 eggs that hatch for the chicks, they do a pretty good job at being able to recruit. And one of the reasons they do this remarkable thing about woodcock is they grow so quickly that within 4 weeks, a chick that is born in mid-May in the mid-Hudson region, by mid-June, this bird is already almost at full adult weight. Can you believe that? So 4 weeks, they're packing on the feed bags, they're eating all these earthworms and protein, and they're growing incredibly fast. And that's part of their recruitment strategy. So within 2 weeks, they can fly. Their earthworms make up 60% of their diet. If it's not earthworms, it's like different kinds of bugs. It might be centipedes or millipedes or any other kinds of insects. They'll eat whatever they can, but the earthworms are what they really thrive on. That it's a high protein diet for them. And so hopefully the jumping worms too. Okay, Yuri. And so this is look at this tangle. Isn't it beautiful? It's the kind of tangle, if you're in the woods and you're trying to walk through this, your hat comes off and your pack gets everything's like pulling against you. But the birds love this. The reason this is important is because this provides security. And so Ashley is asking, what were they eating before the introduction of European earthworms? That's a wonderful question, Ashley. What they were eating were the other insects. So they were eating like the centipedes, millipedes, whatever arthropods they could find, whatever insect protein they could find, I'm guessing. So they still use about like 30 to 35% of their diet would be that other insect protein. And so I'm guessing that's probably what happened. But the earthworms really dialed in. They're just like wonderfully made for this. They have the long bill, they wobble around, they can find these earthworms. The picture on the left is what you might see for a nice nesting site that a hen's going to find. Look at all that cover there, right? That cover means security from predators. It means security from like ground predators like raccoons. It's security from like avian predators. So that's an example of the stem density of the tangle and thickness that really helps. And the thickets are gone from my 8-acre woods, says Ruth. And yep, exactly. So that's what happens. Forests are dynamic, right? And just like us, they grow, they get older. And as they get older, what's going to happen is the stem density is going to change. And so things are constantly changing in the woods. And so this is where that active hand of disturbance and management can come into play, where, creating these thickets takes some active work here. And so, if you're in a situation where you can work with a conservation professional at Winnakee to kind of help establish these missing parts, it's going to be great. This picture on the right is one of like an alder field. So like, in alders, these moist sites, bottomlands, the woodcock really love these sites. This is where they find their earthworms. This is where they thrive. Okay. So this is like something that is a habitat feature that's really important to them, that's becoming more scarce on the landscape. Okay, Yuri. We can advance. Okay, so if you're not aware, one of the cool projects that we work with is based at the University of Maine. And Dr. Amber Roth and Dr. Eric Blomberg have been working on this since about 2016, and it's called the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Co-op. That's a mouthful, but if you Google Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Co-op or just Eastern Woodcock Migration, you will find this work. And so they've been tagging woodcock since 2016, and the Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society funds them, of course, in part with a lot of other wonderful partners. And we are learning so much about woodcock migration and their biology and their habitat needs. And just look at all of this. Look at how far they're migrating back and forth, summer to winter to fall. You can see that there's really like two major populations in the East, right? Or in the country. There's like this Minnesota woodcock family that's going up the west side of the Mississippi. And then there's this other woodcock group that's coming up the Appalachian chain straight through the Catskill region, in your region, straight through like the mid-Hudson. A lot of blue there south of Albany, right? And some of them even go up to northern Maine. So some of these birds have been tagged. Average, I'd say, lifespan of an adult woodcock's two years, maybe 3 years. Beyond that, it's normal to have some mortality. But this is really moving the bar in understanding woodcock migration and what they need back and forth between the different times of the year. And so what we know here in the Northeast is this is where they breed. This is where they raise their young. This is where they spend the summers. This is where that young forest habitat is so critical, not only to woodcock, but a whole lot of other species as well, as Bob had indicated earlier, like golden-winged warbler and a whole bunch of other olive-sided flycatchers and so forth. Okay, woodcock. Anybody that wants to have any questions, we can talk later, or you can peg me later, but we also work with ruffed grouse. Ruffed grouse are the tractor putters of the woods. They're also called partridge. If you call them partridge, that's okay. That's wonderful. That's what they are. They love apple orchards. So maybe in the mid-Hudson region, as you were growing up, or on your farms, or on the edge, open fields, in the woods, you might have heard this pop, 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 pop in the spring. And that's a male grouse. And that is a breeding sequence. And so he's sitting on what's called a drumming log, and he's drumming with his feathers and his wings. And that's his mating ritual with the female. All right. And so male grouse will pick up this drumming habitat in the spring for breeding. They'll also drum in the fall, which is dispersal season of the young, where they're establishing territories. Ruffed grouse are spread out all over the country. They're a bellwether species, and like woodcock, their populations have declined over by half, and they're also species of greatest conservation need, not only in New York, but also across the Northeast. Okay. And next slide, please. And one of the cool things about ruffed grouse is just how adaptive they are at eating things. So a key part of habitat management and conservation it's just like us as humans, where it's like we need different kinds of nutrition and we need different things at different times. And we have different patterns at different times of the year, right? A study done in Pennsylvania a few years ago by the Game Commission when they were looking at the crops of grouse. And what they found was that they'll find upwards of 70 different kinds of food sources that grouse will eat throughout the year. 70, 7-0. Okay. So that's going to change during the year, but they'll eat anything from, high bush cranberry. They'll eat wild raisins, wild grapes. They'll eat rose hips. They'll eat mushrooms. They'll eat, all sorts of fruit and mast in the summer while they're brooding. And in the fall, when the mast crops are available, they eat acorns. So the good news is that they can be somewhat adaptive on the food if they have the right cover. Their Achilles heel is cover because their biggest predator would be like goshawks and owls. And so goshawks and owls can't fly through 2,000 stems per acre of beautiful young forest as fast as grouse can, right? So that's their security net. So the limiting factor for grouse is the security cover. If you have security cover, they'll find food. But if the security cover is not there, it's going to be a tough life for a grouse. Okay. Go ahead, Yuri, please. And if you want to talk, if you have any more questions about grouse, similar to woodcock, all sorts of cool biological things to talk about and to learn about them, about their breeding. So I'm happy to chat after the webinar. You can reach out anytime if you have any questions about grouse and their behavior. But I want to bring it up and tee it back up to this conservation work that Winnakee's doing on their preserves, and with you as landowners, and with the work that we're doing with the Ruffed Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. How do we work toward keeping our forest healthy and diverse and resilient so that birds like this can thrive and so that we can have all these other outputs? So as Bob had mentioned, when you look at the hood on the surface, it's wonderful that we have 18 million acres of forest. First of all, I am grateful that we have that many forests in New York. I work in forest conservation because I love forests, like all of you, right? When I'm not working in forest, I'm playing in forest. I'm hiking, I'm fishing, I'm bird watching. I grew up around forests. I cut wood for firewood. And so I want to set that stage that, we all relate to forests in our own ways, along with the scientific approaches to this. So, as we're walking casually through a forest, it looks great. We have a lot to work with. That's a success story. But when you look under the hood, you start seeing these issues that are causing some of these systemic problems. We have fragmentation from development in the Hudson Valley. We have invasive species, right? A lot of invasive species. We have buckthorn, we have multiflora rose, we have barberry, right? That's changing the dynamics of everything. We have not enough variety of species and openings and structure. And these are all creating threats, okay? So next slide, please. And how am I doing on time, Yuri? Can you give me okay, good. So just reel me in when you're ready and we can transition. Ash, oh, that's a great question from David. He's just like saying ash on my property's almost gone. What is a good tree to replace it with? Ash is a wonderful tree. I'm sorry. Like, I know we have emerald ash borer problems here. Native trees, any other native trees that you think can be adaptable to that property, I think there's a lot of other hardwoods that can fill that role, but ash do play a significant ecological role in forests with their seed sources for birds, for instance. We'll get back to that. So along with forests providing all these benefits, I think it's important to also look at the stresses that they're under. When we're talking about what to do with our forests and how to manage, and how to approach ecological forestry and conservation, we have to understand that there's these impacts and dependencies at play, and there's trade-offs too, and co-benefits. But they're, both climate solutions and they're at, risk from climate change, right? And so there's these and conversations again that keep popping up. And so what we know from research is that, as time goes by and as climate change continues to happen, there's going to be additional stressors that we're going to have to think through and address. And there isn't a one size fits all solution. You as a landowner, can play an active role here. Eli says, is deer overabundance undermining forest under diversity, understory? Yeah, like deer browsing is an issue. That's a whole topic in itself. What are important forest understory shrubs? Yeah, a lot of understory shrubs. Anything like red osier dogwood, silky dogwood, beaknut hazel, high bush cranberry, arrowwood. Yeah, Japanese knotwood is definitely an invasive. So, yep, all these things. Good job, like highlighting some of this stuff. This is great conversation. Next slide, please, Yuri. Okay, and this is another one of those take-home messages where, just like in our homes, birds have different habitat needs. Like, so in your house, imagine if you just had one big living room, right? And you didn't have a kitchen. So it could work, but it wouldn't work well, right? You need the kitchen to eat, right? You need the living room for space. You need the security of your bedroom. So it's kind of like that with forests too. If you think about the different age groups of forests through forest renewal, from a very small seedling up until like the pole-sized trees to the very large trees, as being functional rooms for wildlife. You begin to understand and see that like a lot of birds occupy different stages of this development, and that they depend on it, and that they depended on different times of the year too, right? And so what a grouse needs in March is very different than what a grouse needs in August. And so having this diversity really helps wildlife, and it just kind of helps with the forest health and functionality too. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is just continuing on. And so saw timber, all age, old forest. Look at all these species, like ovenbird. I guess what I want to point out here is that there's birds that occupy all of these different stages of forest development, right? And so you look at like the ovenbird, for instance, you can see that, they're using saw timber, like this nice 12, 14-inch size tree stands. They're using these uneven age stands. They're using old forests. And so having all of this on the table is optimizing habitat for wildlife. And you can simultaneously manage for all the other outputs that you're managing for your conservation goals. So one of the things we do here with RGS is we work with private landowners through USDA programs called Working Lands for Wildlife. And so the focal species for that program here in New York is golden wing warbler. It's a neotropical migratory bird, small, slim gray bird with yellow on its wings and head. It breeds here in New York in shrublands and young forests, and it spends the winters in shaded coffee plantations in places like Honduras and Guatemala. And so in New York, golden wing has kind of like two different populations. Like one core population is right in your neck of the woods in the Hudson Valley and Catskills. And the other is like up in the St. Lawrence Valley and around the fringes of like the Essex and Lake Champlain. And so they love these kind of areas where valley lands, like really shrubby wetlands, patchiness, a lot of deciduous cover. They prefer like 70% deciduous cover. The reason we work on golden wing habitat is that, golden wing is another one of those focal species where the practices that we're working with landowners are benefiting a whole lot of other species. So this is how we get, funded. And so, this is just an example of best management practices. And if you're working with Jen or Trevor or anybody else at Winnakee, these kinds of resources are available to our partners. And this is the kind of thing as we're like architecting habitat and looking at viability for habitat work, then that's the considerations. They're called like best management practices. Just a question in the chat box I just saw popped up about minimum acres and sizes. So if you're a landowner and you have some ground, if you have a 1/4 acre opening, that's good for woodcock. That's a singing ground if it's near some other components of habitat. You don't need like hundreds and hundreds of acres for woodcock. You can look at like what's the minimum kind of thing, what's the missing part, and look beyond at what's happening on your neighbors. And you can work. If you got 10 acres, you can work with woodcock habitat. A grouse kind of block might be 40 acres, really, if you want to get into it. And so, grouse management is about just getting 4 or 5 different age classes within 40 acres and getting that nice rotating mosaic. But doing that, same thing with woodcock or same thing with golden wing, really helps a lot. You get the patchiness, you get the cover. Golden wing, minimum size acre treatments are like 5 acres. But again, working with a professional, you can look at what's going on around you, and there's just so much we can do for wildlife. We can plant trees and shrubs for understory stuff if we don't have a lot of ground to really manage from a silviculture standpoint. So there's always an action that a landowner can take to advance habitat. That's I think a takeaway. Okay, Yuri, we'll keep going here, and I'll introduce Jen. So again, this is and I just saw Adrian just says, here's an example, 2 acres with woods and fields on the side, and it sounds like there's woodcock. So you can see the species here. I included this as an example of additional like young forest and shrubland species, veg species that they like: alders, willows, red osier dogwood, meadow sweets, red maple, tamarack, or larch, aspen for sure. Okay. So, you can work with a conservation partner like Trevor or Jen here. They can look at what's going on with the wetland shrub communities around, figure out if it's a good candidate for management or not. But you have a lot of options here. Okay. And American woodcock management, I included this, is this is an example. What I wanted to highlight here was a lot of similarities and carryover. So if you're managing for golden wing, there's just so much carryover for woodcock, and it's the same kind of thing. It's just like if you have a situation where you can take an active hand to promote these young forest features and shrubland features and create the density and the rooms in the house that they need, it's helping things. I think somebody just asked, like, is it good to leave woody cover on the ground? So if a tree falls and, you have woody structure on the ground, I think so. Yeah, it provides structure, like with grouse, like they like drumming logs, for instance, and having downed woody debris in the woods will help with that. And it just provides some structure and it keeps that biomass on site. So unless it's in your trail where it's in the way, and it's as long as it's congruent with your recreational use and getting around the property, I'd say it's good. Okay, Yuri, please. I think that's it. So I hope that was enjoyable and helpful. Are there any program for Western New York landowners? Reach out to me. My email, I think, will be included in this at the end, but toddw@ruffgrousesociety.org, and we can connect you. I don't have staff in Western New York, but we have partners through NIFOA. We have forestry partners that we work with and land trusts out there. So there's always help wherever you're located in New York. There's always conservation partners that you can work with. And so partnerships matter. And with that, I'd like to pass it along to Jen. Jen Adams, Director of Land Stewardship at Winnakee. Jen oversees the management of the land trust preserves, and her responsibilities include trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, habitat management across Winnakee lands. And she's going to be talking about some of her wonderful on-the-ground work and what that's doing for wildlife and forests. Go for it, Jen.
Thank you so much, Todd. It's going to be a little bit hard to follow you after that great presentation. So, like Todd touched on, young forests support a large diversity of species. And not only do they support species that depend on this particular habitat, but they often serve as transition zones between other habitat types and can provide for species that use early successional meadow habitat, all the way to species that use older forest types. And here's some pictures of some of the species that are abundant in these young forests beyond just birds that we've talked about so far. And we often see these species at our preserves, including songbirds, snakes, and small rodents that use these young forests as cover, like Todd was talking about, as well as the predators that depend on these prey species like owls, fishers, and bobcats. Next slide. All right. So I want to provide some examples of properties that Winnakee owns that have young forest. Dutchess Gables is located in Stamford, New York, and it's publicly accessible with over 4 miles of trails. The property was historically farmland, and it's been allowed to regenerate naturally, resulting in large swaths of young shrubby forest habitat, which you can see in purple on the map I outlined. In my time with Winnakee, we've seen a large number of non-venomous snakes, cottontails, woodcocks, warblers, and a lot of other songbirds, and many, many birds of prey like red-tailed hawks. All right, so we just acquired this property in the winter through a generous donation, and it's a good example of young forest that is slightly older than the shrubby habitat we have at Dutchess Gables. This young forest has many dense young trees throughout the area that's colored in purple on the map there. On this property, we have confirmation a lot of the predators that rely on the prey species found in young forests, like owls, bobcats, and fishers. And here are 2 pictures from the property of a fisher and a bobcat. All right, so what is Winnakee doing? We conduct a lot of wildlife surveys on our properties to determine the species present and the relative abundance. And we do this through fecal collections, cameras, and other techniques like trapping and cover boards. These surveys help us understand how to better manage the land to support the species that currently live there or could live there. For invasive species removal, this is one of the major challenges of young forest management. Invasives love disturbed, sunny areas, and we tend to get a lot of invasions of shrubby species like autumn olive, buckthorn, barberry, multiflora rose, bittersweet vines, like Todd was talking about. We do have a plan to maintain the existing young forest at Dutchess Gables through rotational cutbacks of the area. So as needed, we will cut back portions of the young forest to maintain it as such. Our first cutback will focus on removing some of the largest mature autumn olive shrubs I've ever seen in my life. And hopefully that will encourage some of the native shrubs to reestablish in that area. We're really passionate about engaging the community. I have a volunteer program called Second Saturday Stewardship that gets the community involved in invasive species removal in a lot of these areas. We have an event coming up in our young forest at Dutchess Gables on May 10th. We'll be removing barberry, which is an invasive shrub that's known to cause increased tick abundance. So removing barberry will not only increase the fitness of the species that live in these areas, but it'll reduce any potential harm to humans walking on the trails. Winnakee also conducts landowner workshops throughout the year to teach people about how to implement best management practices on their own land. We have one coming up on May 17th to teach landowners about crafting a silvicultural management plan. So if you're local, I really encourage you to come out to some of these events. And now I'd like to turn it over to Trevor Keough. Trevor Keough is Winnakee's conservation forester, leading initiatives on Conservation First Forestry and providing landowner assistance. He will be discussing forest management planning and various forestry tools that support the creation of young forests on the landscape.
Thanks, Jen. I really enjoy listening to you and Todd both speak. So if you felt bad about following Todd up, I've got like double the pressure at this point. But so for my portion of this presentation, I'm going to walk you through how we as conservation professionals make these determinations and management decisions. But before we really get into that, there's a few overarching points that kind of follow up with a lot of what Todd said. And so we first have to take this really broad view of the forest before we can start to dive in and make these individual management changes or manage inside of these units. And we do that through intentional planning and using a variety of treatments that we have in our tool belt. And this allows us to shape that forest to reflect these desired conditions where we can balance age, structure, and species composition, which all helps with enhancing resilience and biodiversity. And then the follow-up is to carefully implement these strategies on the ground. And by doing this, we cultivate a healthy, diverse, and adaptable forest that will thrive with generations to come. And so one of the things that, it's always prevalent in my head is that we have to look at the forest, not just the trees, to understand the full story of nature's design. Go ahead, Yuri. So some of you might be wondering how we come up with these plans, what steps go into building sustainable management plans, and that's really what we're going to kind of work through. But as Jen said, we're going to start by practicing Conservation First Forestry, which is where we're balancing habitat creation, forest health, and long-term sustainability. And then using thoughtful management, we can ensure that our forests are going to remain productive, resilient, and beneficial for both wildlife and future generations. So I think with that, we can dive into how we get to these plans and the outcomes of it. So the first thing you're going to want to do with your forest is you have to define your goals and objectives. And that can be kind of tough. So if you're really unsure of where to start by looking at what you really love about your property or the woods, and then build it from there. And once we've come up with that clear vision, it's time to connect with a local professional to help bring that to life. And for many of us that don't have a forester or are looking for a forester, there are a lot of resources, such as the ones listed here, the DEC Cooperating Foresters List, recommendations from your neighboring landowners, New York Forest Owners Association, Society of American Foresters, Association of Consulting Foresters. And as we develop this Conservation First Forestry program, us as your resource to help connect you with local trusted foresters. So after we've hired our forester, there are really 4 steps into implementing your Conservation First forestry practices. And as I said, the first is to define your goals and objectives. You're going to want to consider things like wildlife, aesthetics, recreation, and income. The second part of that is to conduct a forest inventory and create detailed maps of your property. And this allows us as professionals to understand what your forest structure is, what are the current conditions, what's the habitat like, and then we use the map to break it into management units to make these decisions and allocate those resources to the correct places. Once we've done all the fun field work, we get to come back and draft up your management plan, and then it's time to sit down and go over it with them and suggest any necessary adjustments that you feel you'd like to see within your plan. And then this is kind of the fun part for us as professionals, is when we get to implement the plan, when we get to put the rubber to the road. As Todd was using car references, I'm going to stick with that. We get to put the rubber in the road during this. This is where we're putting the plan in action to achieve your long-term goals. And so I wanted to include, this is one of our properties, I wanted to include just an example of a map. I know Todd shared one, but if you look at it, there are numbers which are identifying all of the individual management units, or stands as we call them. The black outline is the property boundary, and then those internal red lines are delineating each of those management units. And we base those off of similar species, topography, access, soil type, and a whole variety of things. And then those green hatched areas represent non-forest or wetlands, or areas that will require different conservation practices. Go ahead, Yuri. So now we're on that step 3 of the plan, which is once the forest is inventoried and everything's done on it, we have that management plan getting developed. And this is where your forester is going to document your goals and then provide you with the strategies to achieve them. And while these plans are usually very robust and have a lot of things, each management unit is going to have a specific set of information to help you achieve that long-term plan. And part of that's to understand the forest type. And by that, I mean, is it a northern hardwood stand with sugar maple, yellow birch, beech, or is it an Appalachian hardwood stand that's oak dominated? Or is it softwood with tamarack or spruce or balsam fir? And then what the structure and volume is, because this will help us determine if it's a commercial operation or if we need to seek those third-party partners and find funding to implement the practices. What are the current habitat conditions? The stand description, how do I get to it? What's the topography? What are the soils? Because that's going to drive what trees are going to thrive there. And then finally, we have our stand goals and future plans. Each goal for that stand should help meet your long-term vision for your property. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot in it, but things that we really want to include to kind of build out this conservation forest management plan is what's the history of the property? What are the overall soils? How do we get to the property? What are the timber and non-timber markets in the area? Significant natural communities, threatened and endangered species, wildlife observations, and pests and invasives. And so sticking with our young forest theme, and I know there's some words on here that have certain emotions attached to them, but I think these are the most common, and Todd, you can correct me on this, but the most common silvicultural approaches to create young forest within our region. And this list is not a catch-all. There are a lot of variety of practices, but I felt these were the ones that were going to be the most relevant. And so you're going to see a lot of, there's clear cut, patch cut, strip cut. Those are all very similar, but the scale and the way that we implement them is different. And group selection, if you read the descriptions, boy, that sounds an awful lot like a patch cut. And I would agree, it's very close, but patch cuts are more designed to create what we would call even-aged areas, and group selections are typically smaller and help kind of foster that uneven age type forest that we might be going for. We have expanding gaps, and then we have a seed tree, which is where we leave a handful of mature trees on the landscape to provide seed and naturally regenerate while providing that mature cover. And so it's important to think about that while you define your own vision for the land, it's your forester who plays a key role in bringing that to life. And that's done through a well-crafted management plan and the on-the-ground implementation. And so it's a long-term commitment. I threw this picture in here because it's one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken in the woods. And if you look just above my thumb to the left at that little brown dot, that is the pith, or what we call the pith. That is the youngest point of that tree. And everything to the right of it is how much it had grown. I didn't have time to count all those growth rings, but I'd be willing to bet that it's well over 100 years old. And so while our forests do regenerate naturally, this is a slow process. And so what we do today not only impacts us, but it's going to impact future generations that are coming behind us. So it's imperative that we implement these sustainable, go back, Erie. So it's imperative that we implement these sustainable management practices. And by doing this, we maintain healthy and thriving forests. We support diverse and abundant wildlife, and then we can ensure that our forests remain forests for years to come. And so by investing in Conservation First Forestry today, we can secure that beauty and benefit of our forest for the future. Now we can go. And so another thing, management plans do span over multiple years. And so it's important to realize that once all this has been done and we've crafted the management plan, it may take 15 years to fully implement everything that was inside of that plan. And to make sure that it's effective and that we follow through with all the actions that we'd outlined, we're going to want to stay in communication with your forester, with us, whoever's overseeing the management. And then you're going to want to be able to be flexible. Forest management is dynamic. Things change, the landscape changes. And so having that adaptability and then being able to monitor and adjust your property, because things happen. We have storms, we have pest outbreaks, we have market shifts. All of this can kind of make us pivot in our management, but still maintain that overall goal. Go ahead, Yuri. And so as my last little slide here, as Winnakee's conservation forester and rolling out this landowner assistance program, we kind of want to bullet, some of the services that we'll be able to offer people in this region. And that is to connect you with a trusted local forester. We can help you assist or develop and refine your management goals. We're happy to engage with your forester to make sure that we are overseeing those best management practices that Todd had mentioned earlier. We're happy to review your management plans as needed and make suggestions. I'm always down to walk in the woods. So walking your land with you to assess tree health, habitat quality, and the overall forest conditions, and then providing guidance on sustainable practices, wildlife conservation, and climate resilience. And so as a little ending note here, your forest is a valuable resource. So let's work together to protect and enhance it for years to come. Good on that one. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Yuri, for putting on a fantastic webinar, and Todd and Jen for beautiful contributions to this and so much knowledge and information. So I think we're going to pass it back for questions.
Hi, so I have a first question for you all. How do these young forest techniques, can you talk a little bit about the co-benefits of them in terms of both habitat creation and forest regeneration? Todd, you or Trevor?
That co-benefit talking.
Would you like to lead with that, Trevor? And then I can chime in.
Well, I'd love to hear what you have to say first.
Yeah. So exactly. So there's co-benefits. So with the forest renewal process and the regeneration, there's, a lot of benefits that are broader than just the habitat quality, right? So we end up with forest age class diversity, which spreads out risk. Like when we looked at all those risks associated with invasives and climate change and bugs and so forth, it spreads out the risk for your forest to have diversity in age classes. It also, some of those techniques work towards species diversity too, because of tolerance to shade and intolerance, right? So like a lot of species, some shade intolerant species, the aspens that are wildlife important, some of the other species, they need light. Cherries need light. And so there's ranges of tolerance for shade and for sunlight for those to thrive. And so by regenerating these stands, you also end up with more species on the ground. As the canopies close, you end up with, sometimes less species diversity from a tree standpoint. The other thing I would add is we get into a lot on the carbon benefits of this with forests and the trade-offs that we have to navigate with young forests, old forests, where, old forests store a lot of carbon. And so, there's benefits on the sequestration side, on the sucking up, right, of sequestering carbon to have multiple age groups of trees. If you have young trees that are growing fast on their sigmoid curve, that's bringing, sucking in more carbon. And then you have kind of a sequestration and carbon balance there. And all of those are important. If you manage for ecological outputs, then those outcomes, come out of it. If you're managing for one particular thing, you end up having to trade off other values that are part of that co-benefit. Hope that's helpful. Trevor, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I would just echo, the resilience aspect of it is as forests regenerate, we do have succession. So there will be pioneer species that come in that are typically shorter lived. And then we have these longer living species such as sugar maples and oaks. And unfortunately, I mean, hemlock woolly adelgid, but hemlocks. And so there's a natural phase that happens. And when you can implement it strategically across your property, you ensure that you still have that diversity of tree species and different structures.
Here's a good question. Can you explain how a 480A compliant management plan can assist in building long-term habitat and shrub stock?
I'd be happy to. 480A is it's just another form of a management plan. And so if that is a goal of yours, describing that to your forester that's writing the plan so that they can then put it in the goals. And so it's still the same management plan. It just has certain state requirements as far as when it gets turned into them, and that a commercial activity has to occur within the 15-year window that you're enrolled in the program. And so by working with your forester, they can add that to your plan if that's something that you're interested in.
Great, thanks, Trevor. Here's a question probably for Jen. Do you transplant native plants after you remove invasive?
Yeah, and I tried to answer this in the chat, but maybe I'm not good at technology. We do sometimes. It really depends on the area. If we have a lot of dense native shrubs already present, we tend to let those just, reestablish in the areas where we remove invasives. But sometimes we do live staking. A lot of our wetland shrubs are really great at just being transplanted on site, or we'll plant plants as needed too.
Here's a question about deer management. How can we lobby for deer management to help forest? I think we all, yeah, familiar with the deer. Do you have some deer management advice?
There are a few models that are being tested, some of which, and I'm not exactly sure of where it is, so I won't do that because I don't want to mislead anyone, but I know they use an earn a buck tag. And so for every doe that's harvested, the hunter can then be awarded another buck tag. And the thought behind that is that it's going to encourage folks to get out, because if they can harvest more and everybody loves that big charismatic deer, they're more likely to harvest more does and hopefully kind of bring that population down.
Are you having beach issues? How do you control?
Here in the Adirondacks, where I'm located, we definitely have beach issues. Beach is pervasive in the understory, and it's there's beach health issues, and so it's a regeneration problem. It interferes with other regeneration for sugar maple and yellow birch, and so we're experimenting. There isn't a one size fits all solution, but sometimes we experiment with the timing of some of our entries, like summer timing versus winter timing with ground disturbance, which more ground disturbance might help sugar maple and yellow birch regeneration, and just kind of work up the beach interfering competing veg. We're using Regenerate New York funding to mechanically treat some of that beach in some regeneration sites. It's a big challenge, especially up here. But there have been some situations where we've been able to handle it. And so if you're having a beach problem, talk to Trevor or Jen, and can look into Regenerate New York and other programs, and we're happy to share like what we're doing on some of our forestry projects up here to mitigate that.
Great. A few people have asked this question about invasives that they have, but those invasives are helping to provide shrubby areas for wildlife, and how to balance that. Jen, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So I always recommend, removing things slowly and replacing as you go if you're going to just be clearing an area. Like I talked about with what we're doing at Dutchess Gables, we're doing like a rotational cutback. So cutting back just a small area and then allowing it to regrow, and then focusing on a new area once that one has regrown. So yeah, it definitely can be good habitat for now, but we should always focus on native species that will provide the food and forage that these species need.
Thank you. From Ashley, can anyone speak to white pine population health in our area? Is Bob on the call still?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Can you talk about white pine?
I'm not familiar with any white pine problems down here these days. We don't have a tremendous population of it, other than up in the Catskills. Was there a particular problem that they were noticing? I mean, it could, there are dozens of different diseases and insect pests that can impact a white pine. It could be a great many things. I don't think there's a
She
general
says,
decline.
she says, seeing a lot of dying white pine trees, particularly
Are
as
they
you
dying?
cross the Rhine Cliff Bridge.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll take a look at that.
Another
Does she
person
remember
is chiming in. Yeah, they don't look
they
healthy
dying?
around.
If they're close to the road, it's probably salt. If it's in the woods, it could be a number of different things. One of the things to notice is, are they dying from the base of the crown to the top, or from the top of the crown downward? Do you see any, are you seeing any, black like fungal bodies on the needles, particularly in the lower branches? It could be, it really could be, there's no way for me to diagnose it over over a Zoom call, but it could be, I'm not aware of any general issues across the region that are a particular problem for white pine. It's probably something very specific to that location, but I'll keep my eyes open after I go over the bridge later on today.
Okay, Ashley says, great to hear it's not a huge issue. Okay, great. I think that about wraps up our Q&A. And I just want to again encourage, if people have questions that come up later, please reach out to our speakers. And we're here to support landowners. And we're really thrilled that you were here today to help us celebrate International Day of the Forest. So thank you for being here, and go off and enjoy this beautiful weather. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, everyone.